next one positioned now.
This intelligence is flawed. They can't be advancing there.
Commissaires!
My reports confirm the sighting. We have to assume they are correct.
On the morning of October 25, 1944, a small force of American escort carriers and destroyers found itself between the Japanese center force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers representing the last major surface combat power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the landing beaches of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War had just put American troops ashore. The escort carriers were slow, lightly armored, built on merchant ship hulls, designed to provide air cover for convoys rather than to fight fleet actions. The destroyers were the smallest fighting ships in the American inventory. Against them was a Japanese force that included the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with guns that could fire shells weighing 3,000 pounds, and a collection of heavy cruisers and destroyers that could have destroyed the escort force in minutes. The American force did not run. The destroyers made smoke and attacked. The escort carrier aircraft flew attack after attack with bombs designed for ground support rather than ship killing. The men in those ships did something extraordinary, something that is remembered as the Battle off Samar, and that stands as one of the most remarkable feats of American naval courage in the entire war. They held on. They died in significant numbers. And they confused the Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, so thoroughly, his ships taking hits from aircraft and from destroyer torpedoes, the smoke obscuring the scale of the force opposing him, the ferocity of the American resistance making the escort force seem larger and more dangerous than it was, that Kurita turned away. He withdrew. The landing beaches at Leyte were saved. They were saved by the courage of sailors who had no business being in that fight. They were in that fight because the man who was supposed to be protecting them, the man with the fast carriers and the heavy ships that could have fought and defeated Kurita's force before it reached the escort carriers, had taken the entire Third Fleet north to chase a decoy. The man was William Frederick Halsey, Jr., Bull Halsey, the most aggressive American naval commander in the Pacific, the man whose fighting spirit had sustained the fleet through the darkest days of the Guadalcanal campaign, the man whose name was synonymous in the American press and the American public mind with naval offensive power. He had taken every fast carrier in the Pacific, every battleship, every heavy ship, the entire covering force that was supposed to protect the Leyte landing operation, and he had taken them north chasing Japanese carriers that had been deliberately deployed as bait. The bait worked, and the result was the Battle off Samar, a battle that the American sailors won through courage that no one could require of them, against odds that no plan had intended them to face. This is the story of what Halsey did at Leyte Gulf, why he did it, and what it means for understanding the most aggressive and most celebrated and most flawed American naval commander of the Second World War. It is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a specific kind of military excellence that carries within it the seeds of its own most dangerous failures. I want you to subscribe now if you haven't already. This series is about the specific decisions of the specific people who fought the war, not the sanitized version, not the heroic version alone, but the full human truth of what those decisions were and what they cost. Subscribe and share this. Back to Halsey, back to October 1944, and the decision that almost destroyed the Leyte landing. The specific voice of the men who fought at Samar, preserved in oral histories and memoirs and the accounts of survivors, provides a human dimension that the operational analysis and the command accountability arguments tend to leave out. Robert Copeland, the commanding officer of the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, addressed his crew before leading them into the attack with words that have been quoted in every account of battle since. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds in which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The Roberts was sunk. Copeland survived. He spent the rest of his life honoring the men who had gone with him into that fight, and he spent the rest of his life maintaining a very clear view of why they had been in that fight in the first place. Ernest Evans, who commanded the Johnston and who drove his ship at the Yamato and who fought until the Johnston sank beneath him and who died in the waters off Samar, had commanded his ship with exactly the fighting spirit that the Navy had built the Pacific War's destroyer force to embody. His Medal of Honor citation describes his actions in the standard language of official military recognition: extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry. And the language is accurate and insufficient simultaneously, because the reality of what Evans did went beyond the categories that official recognition provides. The escort carrier commanders, particularly Clifton Sprague, whose cool professionalism in a situation that had no precedent and no plan, directed their aircraft and their ships in ways that produced maximum harassment of the Japanese force at minimum organizational coherence, because maximum organizational coherence was not available. He used what he had. The smoke screens that his carriers made reduced visibility for the Japanese gunners. The aircraft attacks, even with the wrong ordnance, forced the Japanese ships to take evasive action that interrupted their fire. The destroyer attacks created the impression of a more dangerous force than what was actually there. And Kurita, facing this confused and aggressive opposition, made the decision to withdraw. The specific question of why Kurita withdrew, whether it was the American resistance or uncertainty about the strategic situation or a combination of both, has been debated by historians for decades. The Japanese after-action record suggests a combination of factors. The American resistance had disrupted the Japanese formation and inflicted unexpected losses. Kurita was uncertain about the composition of the American force and feared the presence of heavy American ships that were not actually there, and his communications with fleet headquarters had broken down in ways that left him uncertain about the overall situation. Whatever Kurita's specific reasons, the practical effect was that the landing beaches at Leyte were not reached by the Japanese surface force. The invasion was not disrupted. The Leyte landing proceeded, and the men of Taffy III, the ones who survived, came back from a battle that had required everything they had and more than any plan had required of them. The survivors carried the Samar battle with them in a specific way that men carry the battles they barely survived, with pride in what they had done, with grief for the men who did not come back, and with a clear sense of specific context in which the battle had been necessary. The oral histories that have been collected from Taffy III survivors consistently include the knowledge of why they were in that fight, the understanding that the covering force had left, that the San Bernardino Strait had been unguarded, that the Japanese had found the opening and used it, and that Taffy III had been between the Japanese and the beaches when the Japanese came through. This knowledge, the knowledge of the operational context that produced the battle, was part of what the survivors carried. It coexisted with the pride and the extraordinary performance of their ships and their crews. Both things were true simultaneously, and the survivors understood both. The specific relationship between institutional recognition and the historical record is one of the most persistent tensions in the Halsey story. The Navy's institutional response to Leyte Gulf, the defense of Halsey's decision, the award of the Fifth Star, the maintenance of the public image, reflected the institutional priorities of the period. The historical record that had been built in the decades since has been more willing to hold both the heroism and the command failure in the same frame, and to maintain the connection between the two that the institutional account had tended to soften. The connection is this: the extraordinary courage of the men of Taffy III and the command failure that created the situation requiring it are not separate stories. They are one story. The courage was a response to the situation. The situation was a consequence of failure. Understanding the full story requires holding both elements simultaneously, without allowing the one to efface the other. The men who fought at Samar would, I think, want to be remembered in exactly this way. Not just as heroes, which they were, but as men who were placed in an extraordinary situation by specific decisions and who responded to that situation with everything they had. The heroism is more complete, more human, more honest when it is understood in context rather than abstracted into a timeless monument to courage. The context was a command failure. The response was a heroism. Both are the story. There is one more dimension of the Halsey story that deserves attention before we close, and it concerns the relationship between Halsey's specific failure and the institutional culture that produced him. Halsey was not an accident. He was a product of a naval culture that valued aggressiveness above almost everything else, that had selected for the specific quality that made him so effective at Guadalcanal and so dangerous at Leyte Gulf. The naval culture that Bill Halsey had decided over decades of peacetime and wartime experience, that the offensive spirit was the most valuable quality in a fighting admiral, and that commanders who possessed it to an extraordinary degree deserved to be trusted with the commands where that quality was most needed. This was not a wrong assessment of what the Pacific War needed. It needed aggressive commanders. Guadalcanal demonstrated this. The Central Pacific Drive demonstrated this. The quality that Halsey embodied was genuinely essential for the Pacific War that was actually fought. The specific failure at Leyte Gulf was the cost of the quality. The specific way in which the same aggressiveness that was essential in offensive situations became dangerous in situations that required a different kind of command judgment. The institutional challenge that this poses is not unique to the Navy or to the Second World War. It is a permanent challenge of large organizations that need to select and develop talent that is optimized for specific situations. How do you identify the situations for which the talent is optimized, and how do you prevent the talent from being deployed in situations for which it is not? The Navy in October 1944 deployed Halsey in a situation that required a quality of judgment he did not have. The result was Leyte Gulf and Samar. The Navy's subsequent reckoning with this, the lessons incorporated into command doctrine, the attention to the specific communication failures that allowed the gap to open, the more careful assignment of commanders to situations suited to their specific qualities, is part of the story that the Halsey episode contributed to the institutional development of American naval command. It was an expensive lesson. The men of Taffy 3 paid the tuition. The institution learned from it, imperfectly and gradually, in the way that institutions always learn. After the fact, incompletely, with a tendency to protect the institutional actors whose failures the lesson required. The men who fought at Samar deserved better than to teach that lesson. They taught it anyway, with everything they had. That is the Halsey War, the broader context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the full strategic situation that produced the specific decisions of October 1944, is essential to understanding both what Halsey did and why the Japanese plan was so effective against him. The American invasion of Leyte in October 1944 was a culmination of the MacArthur strategy we discussed in the previous episode. The return to the Philippines that MacArthur had promised in 1942 and that the July 1944 strategic decision had authorized. The Leyte landing was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War, involving hundreds of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and the full commitment of American naval power in the Western Pacific. Its success was essential not just militarily but politically. The liberation of the Philippines was a fulfillment of the promise, and failure would have been catastrophic in ways that went beyond the immediate military consequences. The Japanese understood this. They had been planning the defense of the Philippines, and the specific naval battle they hoped would reverse the strategic situation, since the American advance toward the Philippines had made a Leyte landing inevitable. The Shogo Plan, which produced the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was designed around a single operational concept: use what remained of Japanese naval power to destroy the American landing force, accepting the loss of the ships as the price of inflicting a defeat that might make the Americans reconsider the invasion. The specific design of the plan, the three-force attack with the carrier decoy as its centerpiece, was a sophisticated acknowledgement of Japanese weakness. The carriers that served as a decoy force under Ozawa were the most visible element of Japanese naval power in American thinking. The American commanders had been hunting Japanese carriers since Midway. Ozawa's force, stripped of its aircraft groups by the Marianas Turkey Shoot, was nearly useless as a fighting force. But it was enormously useful as a decoy, because the Americans did not know how depleted the air groups were, and because the aggressive commander most likely to pursue them was Halsey. The Japanese intelligence assessment that identified Halsey as the key to the plan was accurate. They knew his reputation. They had observed his command style throughout the Pacific Campaign. They knew that an aggressive carrier commander who had been hunting Japanese carriers throughout the war would not be able to resist the opportunity to destroy the remnants of the Japanese carrier force. The plan was designed around that specific weakness of an aggressive commander, the tendency to pursue the most visible and most tempting target, even when the most important target was elsewhere. This is a specific quality of the Japanese plan that makes the Leyte Gulf story so instructive for understanding military command. The Japanese were not simply hoping that Halsey would make a mistake. They were designing the battle to produce a mistake by a specific commander with specific characteristics, exploiting those characteristics as deliberately as a football team exploits a specific defensive weakness. They knew what Halsey would do. They arranged a battle so that what Halsey would do was what they wanted him to do. The counterpoint to this exploitation is the question of what a different commander would have done. What Spruance, for example, would have done if he had been in Halsey's position. The hypothetical is genuinely interesting because Spruance, whose methodical and conservative command style was the opposite of Halsey's instinctive aggressiveness, had faced a somewhat similar situation at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when he was criticized for not pursuing the Japanese carrier force aggressively after the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Spruance had stayed close to the invasion force at Saipan rather than pursuing the Japanese carriers, and he had been criticized by Halsey, among others, for letting the carriers escape. Nimitz had defended him. The argument was that Spruance had correctly prioritized protection of the Saipan landing over the pursuit of the enemy carriers. At Leyte Gulf, Halsey made the opposite choice. He prioritized pursuit of the enemy carriers over protection of the landing force. The Japanese had anticipated this choice. Spruance might have made Halsey's choice at Philippine Sea. If Spruance had been at Leyte Gulf, he might have made the cautious choice that kept the carriers in position to protect the landing. But this is speculation. The specific decision was Halsey's to make, and he made it the way his entire career had prepared him to make it: aggressively, forward-leaning, focus on the enemy force rather than the force he was protecting. The Japanese Typhoon episodes are worth mentioning as additional illustrations of the same pattern. On December 17 to 18, 1944, and again on June 4 to 5, 1945, Halsey's Third Fleet was struck by typhoons that caused significant damage and loss of life. The December typhoon sank 3 destroyers and killed approximately 800 men. The June typhoon damaged dozens of ships and killed hundreds more. In both cases, the post-battle inquiries found that Halsey had received weather warnings that might have allowed him to maneuver away from the storms and had not taken sufficient action on them. The typhoon episodes followed the pattern of Leyte Gulf. A commander whose aggressive forward focus led him to underweight information that counseled caution, with consequences that the men in his command paid for. The specific failure was not the same in each case. The typhoon disasters were navigational and meteorological failures, not tactical ones. But the underlying pattern was consistent. Halsey's command style was optimized for the offensive, and it paid insufficient attention to the information that argued for caution when caution was what the situation required. The American public's image of Halsey throughout the war was, ironically, one of the assets that the Navy was reluctant to impair. The press had billed him into one of the iconic figures of the Pacific War, the Bulldog Admiral who had promised to ride the Emperor's horse down the main street of Tokyo, the fighter who had inspired the fleet through the darkest days of Guadalcanal. This public image made Halsey useful in ways that went beyond his operational performance. He was a symbol of American naval fighting spirit, and symbols serve purposes that operational analysis cannot quantify. The Navy's reluctance to hold Halsey publicly accountable for Leyte Gulf and the typhoon disasters was partly institutional protection, protecting one of its most senior and most celebrated officers, and partly a genuine assessment that the costs of publicly damaging Halsey's image were higher than the cost of the specific failures themselves. The war was being won. The Navy was performing brilliantly in aggregate. The specific failures of a specific commander, however costly, were absorbed into the larger success without the kind of public accounting that might have been expected. Halsey's post-war memoir, Admiral Halsey's Story, presented the Leyte Gulf decision as correct and the criticism as unfair. He was not entirely wrong to push back on some of the post-battle criticisms. The communications failures at Leyte Gulf were genuinely distributed across multiple commands, and the specific attribution of full responsibility to Halsey alone was an oversimplification. But the memoir's fundamental argument, that the decision to take the entire Third Fleet north was strategically sound and defensible, could not fully account for the 7 hours at Samar and the men who died there. He received a 5th star, Fleet Admiral, in December 1945, the same rank given to Nimitz, King, and Leahy. He died in 1959, honored and controversial, with a legacy that the historical record has continued to complicate in the decades since. The men of Taffy III who survived the battle off Samar have generally been less forgiving than the institutional record. They knew what the plan had required of them. They knew what the plan had not required. The gap between the two was the gap that their courage filled, at the cost of their ships and many of their shipmates. The question that the Halsey story poses, and that it cannot fully answer, is the question of what a military organization owes the men who pay the price of its commander's failures. The Navy gave Halsey his 5th star. The survivors of Taffy 3 did not have input into that decision. The historical record has continued to work on the question without reaching a final verdict that satisfies everyone who has a stake in it. The men who fought at Samar, who charged the Yamato with destroyers, who flew attack after attack with the wrong ordnance against battleships, performed one of the most extraordinary military feats of the Second World War. They deserve to be remembered for what they did, in the specific context of why they had to do it, and in the specific context of whose decision created the situation that required of them. That is the full accounting. The courage was extraordinary. The command failure was real. Both things are true. The historical record requires holding both. The specific men who fought in the battle off Samar, the sailors of Taffy 3, the escort carrier task group that bore the brunt of Kurita's attack, deserve specific examination because their story is one of the most extraordinary in the entire Pacific War, and because the institutional framework that placed them in their situation is inseparable from understanding what they accomplished. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a career aviator whose specific experience had been in carrier operations rather than surface warfare. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, the Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcum Bay, and Gamber Bay, and 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were 498-foot ships capable of 18 knots, armed with a single 5-inch gun, and equipped with aircraft designed for anti-submarine patrol and ground support. They were not designed to fight fleet actions. They were designed to support invasions and protect convoys. The destroyers and destroyer escorts that accompanied them, the Hull, Johnston, Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts, were the smallest fighting ships in the American inventory. The Johnston was a destroyer of 376 feet and 2,100 tons. The Yamato was a battleship of 863 feet and 72,000 tons displacement. The Yamato's main battery could fire 3,000-pound shells more than 25 miles. The Johnston's armament was 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. When Sprague's lookouts first spotted Kurita's fleet on the horizon, the distinctive pagoda mass of Japanese battleships rising above the sea, Sprague reported Kincaid's headquarters with a message that contained exactly the right amount of professionalism and barely contained alarm. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and numerous destroyers attacking Taffy 3 from the north. He then did 2 things simultaneously. He ordered his escort carriers to run south at maximum speed, and he ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. The order to the destroyers was not an order to die. It was an order to create a situation in which the escort carriers might survive, to use torpedo attacks and gunfire and smoke to disrupt the Japanese formation, to force Kurita's ships to maneuver defensively, to make the orderly destruction of the escort carriers impossible by placing the destroyers between them and the Japanese guns. The men who received the order understood its implications. The destroyers could not survive a sustained engagement with the Japanese surface force. They could make the engagement sufficiently costly and confusing that the carriers might get away. The Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged, not toward a gap in the Japanese line, not toward the weakest part of the formation, toward the Yamato, toward the largest battleship ever built. Evans brought his destroyer to within 5,000 yards of the Yamato and fired a full spread of 10 torpedoes before the Japanese guns found the range. 2 or 3 of the torpedoes hit a Yamato-class battleship. There is some dispute about which one, and then the Johnston was turned into a burning, listing wreck by the return fire. Evans continued to fight his ship for more than 2 hours, using his remaining guns, directing fire from position the ship where the bridge had been destroyed, until the Johnston went dead in the water and sank with Evans still aboard. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He had been born in Indian Territory in what would become Oklahoma, and he had told his crew, when he assumed command of the Johnston, that he intended to fight the ship aggressively, and that anyone who did not want to fight that way should leave. Nobody left. When the Japanese gunfire was tearing the Johnston apart, when the situation was clearly fatal, the crew continued to fight and to fire and to damage the enemy forces that were destroying them. The Hull and the Roberts were also sunk. Their captains and their crews performed the same kind of extraordinary courage, pressing torpedo attacks against overwhelming force, using their ships as instruments of disruption and delay at the cost of the ships and many of the men in them. The Roberts, a destroyer escort, was described by our commanding officer as defending the escort carriers against a force that might more appropriately have been compared to a BB gun against a tank. The escort carrier pilots, flying aircraft loaded with anti-submarine depth charges and general-purpose bombs rather than armor-piercing ordnance designed for ship killing, may attack after attack against the Japanese surface ships. They were not equipped to sink battleships. They were equipped to harass and delay and confuse, and they did so with persistence that contributed materially to Kurita's decision to withdraw. The specific confusion that Sprague's force created in Kurita's mind, the sense that he was facing something larger and more organized than what was actually before him, was partly the product of the smoke screens, partly the product of the torpedo attacks, and partly the product of the constant air attacks that made it impossible for the Japanese ships to operate without concern for the aircraft above them. Kurita withdrew. He had reasons that went beyond the specific tactical situation. His communications with fleet headquarters had broken down. He was uncertain about the disposition of American forces, and his assessment of the Leyte operation had become confused by the action. But the immediate cause of his withdrawal was the impression that he was facing a larger and more dangerous force than the escort carriers and their escorts, an impression that the extraordinary conduct of Taffy 3 had created and sustained through hours of desperate fighting. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole, the largest naval battle in history, by tonnage of ships engaged, was an American victory in every measurable sense. The Japanese lost 3 battleships for carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, and dozens of smaller vessels. American losses were comparatively small. The landing at Leyte was not disrupted. The Japanese Navy as an organized fighting force was destroyed at Leyte Gulf in ways from which it never recovered. The battle was decisive, but the battle off Samar was a battle that should not have happened. The gap that Taffy 3 filled was a gap that Halsey's decision had created. The courage that filled the gap was courage that no plan had required. And the specific deaths of the men on the Johnson and the Hull and the Roberts and the men on the escort carriers that were sunk were deaths that the plan had not intended, and that should not have been necessary. This is the moral weight that sits at the center of the Halsey story at Leyte Gulf, not the strategic question of whether pursuing Ozawa was the right call, not the communication question of whether Kincaid understood that the strait was unguarded, the specific, irrefutable fact that men died in a battle they should not have been in, and that they died with extraordinary courage that no one could have required of them, because the officer responsible for protecting them had taken his force away to chase a decoy. The relationship between Halsey's decision and the deaths at Samar is not simple. Command decisions in large-scale operations always carry the possibility that the decisions will create dangers for units not immediately in view. Halsey did not choose to expose Taffy 3. He did not know that Kurita had reversed course. He did not know that the San Bernardino Strait was unguarded because he had taken the covering force north. He was operating, as all commanders do, with an incomplete picture of the situation, and the specific incompleteness of his picture was partly the product of intelligence failures and partly the product of communication failures that were not entirely his fault, but they were partly his fault. The failure to verify, specifically and explicitly, that Kincaid understood the strait was unguarded. The failure to close the loop on the one piece of information that was critical to the safety of the landing force was a command failure that sat within his responsibility. The incompleteness of his picture was not entirely his fault. The incompleteness of Kincaid's picture about the strait was partly Halsey's fault. The historical reckoning with this responsibility has been conducted over decades in the memoirs and the official histories and the scholarship that has revisited the Battle of Leyte Gulf many times. The reckoning has not been entirely satisfying, partly because Halsey was not the kind of person who accepted adverse verdicts about his own decisions, and partly because the institutional culture of the Navy in the post-war period was not particularly inclined to adjudicate the responsibility of senior officers in ways that would complicate the heroic narrative of the Pacific War. The honest verdict, arrived at by the best historical scholarship, is that Halsey made a mistake at Leyte Gulf, a mistake that was consistent with his character, that was potentially predictable from his previous performance, and that Nimitz and the command structure bore some responsibility for not having guarded against more effectively. The mistake had consequences that were mitigated by the extraordinary courage of the men of Taffy 3, but that were not erased by that courage. The men who died at Samar died because of the mistake. Their courage was real and their achievement was real, and neither of those things changes the fact of the mistake that created the situation they faced. Halsey continued to command the Third Fleet through the end of the war. His aggressive style produced other results, including 2 episodes in which his fleet was badly damaged by typhoons that a more cautious commander might have avoided, that reinforced a pattern of high variance that defined his command. He was capable of extraordinary things. He was also capable of extraordinary failures. The Pacific War got both from him. He died in 1959 at 76 in the United States, honored and controversial in roughly equal measure. His legacy is a legacy of a commander who was exactly right for some of the most critical moments of the Pacific War, and exactly wrong for some of the most critical moments of the Pacific War, and who spent his career declining to fully distinguish between the two. The men of Taffy 3 did not have that luxury. They were in the situation he had created, and they dealt with it in the way that American sailors deal with impossible situations, by fighting, by dying, by performing extraordinary acts of courage in circumstances that no plan had prepared them for and that no order had required of them. They held the line. The landing was saved. The price was real. That is the Halsey War. William Halsey had been in the Navy since 1904. He had served in destroyers, in battleships, in the early years of naval aviation. He had earned his wings as a naval aviator at the age of 51, one of the oldest men ever to do so, because he believed that a carrier commander needed to understand flying from the inside. His rise through the naval hierarchy had been marked by a reputation for aggressiveness that the Navy valued, the specific willingness to close with the enemy, to press attacks, to keep moving forward when the cautious calculation said to pause and assess. This quality had served him superbly in the Guadalcanal campaign, when Nimitz sent Halsey to command the South Pacific area in October 1942, replacing a commander who was judged to have been too cautious in the Guadalcanal crisis. The effect on the fleet was immediate and significant. Men who had been demoralized by the naval losses around Guadalcanal found in Halsey's aggressive presence exactly the fighting spirit they needed. His famous motto, "Hit hard, hit fast, hit often," was not simply a slogan. It was an operational philosophy that expressed who he was and how he commanded. The specific tactical successes of the Guadalcanal campaign, the naval battles of November 1942, that secured the American position on the island at enormous cost, but also destroyed the Japanese naval forces that had been threatening to overwhelm the garrison, were partly the product of Halsey's aggressive direction. He committed ships in situations where the cautious calculation said to hold back. He accepted losses that a more conservative commander might have avoided, and the results, in the specific context of Guadalcanal in November 1942, were the right results. The Japanese were driven back, the island was secured, and the strategic initiative that Midway had established was converted into the operational advantage that the remainder of the Pacific campaign built on. But the qualities that made Halsey superb at Guadalcanal were different from the qualities that the strategic situation at Leyte Gulf required. Guadalcanal in November 1942 was a fight for survival, a situation in which the aggressive commitment of everything available was the appropriate response because the cost of losing was catastrophic and the alternative to fighting was worse than fighting. Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was a complex, multidimensional operation in which the primary objective was the protection of the landing force, and in which the aggressive pursuit of a Japanese carrier force was not only secondary to that objective, but specifically inconsistent with it. The Japanese plan for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the most complex and ambitious naval operations of the war, was designed precisely to exploit the aggressive tendencies of an American commander like Halsey. The plan involved 3 separate Japanese naval forces, each with a distinct role. The southern force would approach through the Surigao Strait and attack the landing area from the south. The center force, Kurita's force with the Yamato and the heavy ships, would approach through the San Bernardino Strait and attack the landing area from the north. And the northern force, the carrier force with Ozawa's depleted and largely air group-less carriers, would approach from the northeast and serve as the bait that would draw the American fast carriers away from the San Bernardino Strait, leaving it open for Kurita to pass through. The Japanese knew Halsey's reputation. They had designed the Northern Force specifically to exploit it. Ozawa's carriers were nearly useless as a fighting force by October 1944. His air groups had been destroyed in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the ships themselves were more valuable as decoys than as combatants. They were sent north to be found, to be seen, to draw the American carriers after them and away from the objective that actually mattered. Halsey took the bait. The sighting of Ozawa's carriers by American search aircraft on the afternoon of October 24 triggered exactly the response the Japanese had planned for. He ordered the Third Fleet, all of it, including the fast battleships that had been designated as Task Force 34, for exactly the purpose of guarding the San Bernardino Strait against Kurita, to turn north and pursue Ozawa. He sent a message to Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet whose responsibility was a landing force, and to Nimitz, informing them of his intention. He did not, critically, communicate that he was taking Task Force 34 with him, rather than leaving it to guard the strait. He left the San Bernardino Strait open. Kurita's center force, which had been battered by American air attacks on October 24th, and which Halsey and many others believed had been turned back, had in fact reversed course and was passing to the San Bernardino Strait in the darkness of October 24th to 25th. When dawn broke on October 25th, Kurita's force was south of the strait and bearing down on the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. Between it and the beaches were the escort carriers of Taffy 3. The communication failure that produced this situation is one of the most studied episodes in American naval history. Halsey believed he had communicated clearly. Kincaid believed he understood the disposition of Third Fleet's forces. Nimitz's headquarters had a different picture from either of them. The specific mechanisms by which 3 senior commands developed inconsistent pictures of the same situation, and the specific ways that the communications of the time, with their encoding and decoding and transmission delays, contributed to confusion, have been analyzed exhaustively by naval historians. The conclusion that emerges from the analysis is not entirely comfortable for anyone involved. Halsey's specific error was a failure to confirm, before taking Task Force 34 north, that Kincaid understood that the strait would be unguarded. This was not a technical communication failure. It was a failure of command responsibility, a failure to verify that the information that was critical to the safety of the landing force had been communicated clearly to the commander responsible for that force. Halsey had assumed that his message had conveyed what he intended. He had not verified the assumption. This failure, the failure to verify the understanding of a critical command communication, is the kind of failure that senior commanders make when they are focused forward rather than laterally, when they are thinking about their own operation rather than the coordination requirement that their operation creates for others. Halsey in October 1944 was focused forward on the Japanese carrier force that was drawing him north, on the opportunity to destroy the last major Japanese naval force, on the offensive action that was a natural expression of who he was and how he commanded. The crisis, when Nimitz's famous message arrived, whereas Task Force 34 the World Wonders, was resolved by turning the fleet around and heading south. But turning a fleet around takes time, and by the time Halsey's ships were heading back toward the San Bernardino Strait, the battle off Samar was already underway. Task Force 34 arrived too late to engage Kurita's force, which had already turned away before the American heavy ships could reach it. The tactical outcome of Leyte Gulf was an American victory. The Japanese lost 3 of their 4 fleets, including the center force's heavy ships that Kurita lost to the combination of Taffy 3's desperate defense and his own decision to withdraw. The Japanese carrier force that had served as a bait was destroyed. Ozawa's 4 carriers were sunk by Halsey's aircraft in exactly the kind of aggressive carrier battle that Halsey had been built for. The landing at Leyte was secured. The Japanese Navy as an organized fighting force was finished. But the specific episode of the battle off Samar, the 7 hours in which Taffy 3's escort carriers and destroyers fought Kurita's overwhelming force while the fast carriers were hundreds of miles away chasing the decoy, is the episode that defines the historical verdict on Halsey at Leyte Gulf. The men of Taffy 3 performed an act of extraordinary courage that the plan had not required of them and that the plan should not have required of them. They filled a gap that Halsey's decision had created. They paid for it with their ships and their lives. The destroyers Hull, Johnston, and Roberts were sunk. 2 escort carriers were sunk. Hundreds of American sailors died in the waters off Samar in a battle they should not have had to fight. Their courage was real and their achievement was real, and the price they paid was the price of a command failure that was also real. Halsey never fully accepted this verdict. His memoir presented the Leyte Gulf decision as correct, as the right aggressive decision in a situation where the intelligence picture was genuinely ambiguous and where the opportunity to destroy the Japanese carrier force was a legitimate operational priority. The memoir's arguments were not without merit in their own terms. The intelligence picture on the afternoon of October 24th was genuinely uncertain. The presence of Ozawa's carriers was a real threat that could not simply be ignored. The opportunity to destroy the last major Japanese naval force was a legitimate strategic objective, but the specific failure, the failure to verify that Kincaid understood the strait was unguarded, was not a strategic argument. It was a command error, and the specific consequence of that error, the men of Taffy 3 fighting for their lives against impossible odds, was a consequence that no amount of strategic justification could fully absorb. Nimitz's public defense of Halsey after Leyte Gulf, his insistence that the decision, while controversial, had been within Halsey's command authority and judgment, was partly institutional protection and partly genuine. Nimitz understood that the aggressive qualities that had led Halsey to take the bait at Leyte were the same qualities that had made him so valuable at Guadalcanal. The qualities could not be separated. The commander who had never been fooled by a decoy was not the commander who would have sustained the fleet's fighting spirit through the Guadalcanal crisis. You paid for one with the other. The specific assessment of Halsey that the historical record supports is more complex than either the heroic version or the damning version. He was a commander of genuine and significant talent whose specific quality, the aggressive instinct, the forward energy, the willingness to commit and to close, was enormously valuable in the offensive phases of Pacific War and genuinely dangerous in the situations that required a different kind of command judgment. He was, in the specific terminology of military leadership studies, a high-variance commander, capable of extraordinary results when his qualities were suited to situation, and capable of extraordinary failures when they were not. The Pacific War needed him. It also, at Leyte Gulf, nearly suffered a catastrophic failure because of the specific way it needed him. That is the honest verdict. And the men of Taffy 3, who paid the price of the failure and performed the miracle that prevented the catastrophe, deserve to be remembered alongside the verdict. They fought with what they had, against what they faced, in a situation they should not have been in. That is what they did. That is what it cost. And the specific commander whose decision put them there spent the rest of his life declining to fully acknowledge the debt. The Japanese commanders who designed the Shogo Plan, and particularly the officers who designed the specific role of Ozawa's northern force as a decoy, understood something fundamental about the psychology of aggressive command that the American naval establishment had not fully grappled with in its own commanders. Admiral Ozawa, who commanded the northern force and who accepted the role of decoy for his ships and his surviving air crews, was a capable and experienced officer performing a mission that was essentially a sacrifice. He was making his carriers and their crews the bait in a trap, knowing that the American carriers would pursue him and knowing that the American air groups would destroy his air groups before the day was over. He was doing this in service of the strategic objective of allowing Kurita to reach the landing beaches, and he was doing it with a specific knowledge that the American commander most likely to pursue him was Halsey. The intelligence picture that the Japanese had of Halsey derived from observation of his command style throughout the campaign, from the intercepted communications that provided insight into American operational decisions, from the specific pattern of his previous engagements, was accurate enough to serve as a foundation of a tactical plan. They knew he would pursue. They designed the trap around that knowledge, and the trap worked. This is one of the more uncomfortable dimensions of the Leyte Gulf story for the American side. The Japanese, in a war they were losing, achieved a tactical success against one of the most celebrated American commanders by correctly predicting how he would behave in the situation they designed for him. The predictability that had made Halsey effective in offensive operations, the specific, consistent quality of his command style that his fleet could rely on, and that had inspired the fighting spirit of the Pacific Fleet throughout the campaign, was the same predictability that the Japanese exploited at Leyte Gulf. Effective military command requires a degree of consistency and predictability that allows subordinates to anticipate the commander's intentions and act accordingly. It also requires a degree of flexibility and unpredictability that prevents adversaries from designing traps around a commander's known tendencies. These requirements are in tension, and the balance between them is one of the permanent challenges of senior military leadership. Halsey had resolved the tension strongly in favor of consistency and predictability, and the Japanese used that resolution against him. The specific lesson that the Leyte Gulf episode teaches about this tension is not that aggressive commanders are wrong to be aggressive, or that predictable commanders are wrong to be predictable. It is that the management of aggressive and predictable commanders requires the institutional framework to provide the oversight and the coordination that the commanders themselves may not reliably provide. The system failed Halsey and the men of Taffy 3 not because Halsey was the wrong kind of commander, but because the system did not adequately compensate for the specific vulnerabilities that came with the kind of commander he was. The vulnerability was predictability. The Japanese exploited it. The men of Taffy 3 paid for it. The post-war reckoning with this, the incorporation of the Leyte Gulf lessons into American naval doctrine, the attention to the specific communication protocols that had failed, the development of better procedures for ensuring that commanders at different levels had consistent pictures of the disposition of friendly forces, was the institutional response to what the battle had revealed. Whether the response was adequate is a question that subsequent naval history has continued to test, as successive generations of naval commanders have faced their own versions of the tension between aggressiveness and coordination. The men of Taffy 3 did not have the benefit of the institutional lessons. They had the situation as it was. No covering force, overwhelming odds, the landing beaches behind them, and the choice between running and fighting. They chose to fight. Commander Evans drove the Johnston at the Yamato. Captain Copeland told his crew they would do what damage they could. Admiral Sprague turned his escort carriers into the wind and flew his aircraft with the wrong bombs against battleships. And for 7 hours, while the Third Fleet was hundreds of miles north chasing a decoy, they held the line. The courage was extraordinary. The command failure was real. The institution learned, imperfectly and gradually, from both. And the men who died at Samar, who deserved to be protected by the force that had been assigned to protect them, and who were not, are part of the story that the Halsey War requires us to tell completely, without the softening that institutional pride and public heroism tend to impose. They fought with what they had. They died with what they had. They held the line. That is the full accounting. That is the Halsey War. The specific moment in the battle off Samar, when the Japanese ceased their attack and Kurita ordered the withdrawal, is one of those military moments that turns on the interaction between courage and confusion in ways that no planning can fully account for. Kurita had the overwhelming material advantage. His ships were larger, more powerful, and more numerous. His guns could reach the escort carriers from distances at which the escort carrier aircraft could not effectively attack him. His destroyers could have run down the fleeing American ships without difficulty. By any rational military analysis, the battle should have ended quickly with the destruction of Taffy 3 and the exposure of the landing beaches. It did not end that way, because Kurita's picture of the battle was wrong. He believed, on the basis of the American resistance, the torpedo attacks from the destroyers, the constant air attacks from the escort carrier aircraft, the smoke screens that obscured his view, that he was facing a force of heavy fleet carriers and cruisers rather than the escort carriers and destroyers that were actually before him. The ferocity of the American resistance had confused him about the composition of the opposing force, in exactly the way that Sprague's desperate tactics were designed to confuse. This confusion was not accidental. It was a product of specific tactical choices made by specific American officers. Sprague's decision to turn into the attacking Japanese force rather than running, Evans's decision to charge the Yamato, Copeland's decision to press his torpedo attack to within a few hundred yards of the Japanese cruisers. Each of these choices was individually suicidal in its immediate risk. Together, they created a tactical environment in which Kurita could not clearly see what he was fighting and could not be certain that the ships he was pursuing were as unprotected as they appeared. The relationship between the specific courage of the men of Taffy 3 and the specific result of the battle is direct and causal. Kurita withdrew because the American resistance convinced him he was in a more dangerous situation than he was. The American resistance was as fierce as it was because the men in those ships had decided to fight rather than run. The decision to fight rather than run was made by commanders who understood that running meant the beaches and the landing force were unprotected, and that unprotected was unacceptable regardless of the odds. This is the moral core of the Battle off Samar, not the command failure that put Taffy 3 in the position it was in, though that failure is part of the story and must be acknowledged. The moral core is a specific response of the men who found themselves in that position. The decision that running was not the answer, that fighting with what they had was what the situation required, and that the price of that fighting was worth paying if it protected what was behind them. They were right. The price was paid. The beaches were protected. The landing survived. And the Pacific War continued toward its conclusion without the catastrophic reverse that the battle off Samar could have been. Halsey's decision had created the situation. The men of Taffy 3 had resolved it. Both facts belong in the accounting. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was an American victory. The battle off Samar was an American epic. The men who fought the epic deserved the covering force that Halsey had taken north. They did not receive it. They filled the gap with their ships and their lives. That is the honest verdict on the Halsey War. That is the full accounting that the men of Taffy 3 deserve. Halsey died in 1959. Evans died off Samar in October 1944. Copeland died in 1973, having spent 3 decades honoring the men who had gone with him into that fight. Sprague died in 1955, 10 years after the battle that his cool professionalism had helped to survive. The escort carriers are gone. The destroyers are gone. The battleships of Kurita's force are on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The landing beaches at Leyte are ordinary coastline now, returned to the agricultural and commercial purposes of a country that gained its independence in 1946. The battle off Samar is one of the most extraordinary military feats in American naval history. It was made necessary by a command failure. It was won by courage that no command failure can diminish, and that no command excellence could have made unnecessary once the failure had occurred. Both are true. The full story requires both. The specific institutional history of how the Navy processed the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the official inquiries, the after-action reports, the way the lessons were or were not incorporated into subsequent doctrine, is a story that the naval historians have traced in some detail, and that reveals the specific ways that large institutions absorb uncomfortable truths about their most celebrated figures. The Court of Inquiry that examined the Leyte Gulf battle in late 1944 produced findings that were nuanced in their attribution of responsibility and that distribute accountability across multiple commanders and command levels without issuing any specific findings of fault against Halsey. This outcome was partly the product of genuine ambiguity. The communication failures were real, the intelligence uncertainties were real, and the specific responsibility for specific elements of the confusion was genuinely distributed. But it was also partly the product of the institutional instinct to protect its senior officers from findings that would impair their effectiveness in a war that was not yet over. The historians who have examined the record since the war have reached more definitive conclusions. Halsey made a mistake. The mistake had consequences. The institution protected the man who made it from the full accountability that the consequences deserved. And the men who paid the price of the mistake were honored for their courage without the full accounting of why that courage had been required being part of the public record for decades. The full accounting has been assembled gradually and incompletely in the decades since. It is available in the scholarship and preserved in the oral histories of survivors. The accounting is not comfortable. It requires holding simultaneously the extraordinary courage of the men who fought and the command failure that put them in a position where that courage was required. The men of Taffy 3 deserve the full story. They fought for it. The least the historical record can do is tell it.